going to talk to you a little bit about the first part of our project, which focused on identifying the cities and mapping what they are doing. All right. Yeah. So we actually started by finding out which cities are implementing practices towards becoming or reinforcing their 50-minute city status. And then after identifying cities, we moved on into identifying the practices that they are putting in place. And with this information, we try to build a typology of 50-minute city practices. It's important to point out that we are talking about 15-minute city practices and not 15-minute cities themselves. So when we were identifying the cities, we also looked at cities that self-advertised themselves as being 50-minute city, but we did not measure it in that sense. So with this focus on practices, we did a comprehensive literature review, both academic and gray literature. We also had an expert survey to gather as many cities possible in our review. And we also did a web search, essentially for cities that self-advertise themselves. And before I show you the results, I wanted to show you the other terms that popped up. Of course, we didn't only look at the term or the concept of 50-minute city, but other terms popped up besides of this one, the 15-minute neighborhood, 20-minute neighborhood, the super blocks, the proximity city, the walking city, complete neighborhood. So a number of different concepts appeared during our search. In most cases, the definition emphasized the access to essential destinations within a given travel time by walking, cycling, and sometimes also by public transport. But some have some differences. They give relevance, for instance, to comfort or to prioritizing social aspects, or others actively restrict the cars. But regardless of the difference, it's clear that they share similar principles. So moving then on to our results. In our survey, we found a total of 94 different cities for this 15-minute city practice mapping. We actually had 98 cases, but some of them are super level to the city, so either at the regional level or at the national level. And in this presentation, I'm going to focus only on these 94. You can find more information in the final report. Actually, among these cities, most of them were from Europe, so the large majority, but you also have a large amount of them in North America, Asia, and so on. So you can see the distribution in Europe better here, which is harder to see in the global map. So as I told you, after identifying the cities, we moved on to identifying the practices, and we found 414 different practices, so measures, policies, and of these, then to further understand, because it was a very large amount of practices, we classified these into different criteria. A first set of criteria focused on the practice level. So we looked at the scale of the practice, the status, if it's implemented or not. And it's interesting to point out that actually only 13 of the 94 cities had measures that were already implemented. The remaining either were planned or we didn't have information about that. We also looked at if there were goals or targets, and or if they were radical measures. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about this later. We also looked at if they, how they related with the key areas of action from the DOT. But even besides of that, we felt the need to create a list, which in this case gave 36 different keywords, to help us group these 414 measures together. These 36 keywords then were again grouped into three large groups of land use measures, transport measures, and planning measures. So this to have a better understanding of the diversity of measures we were looking at. Besides of that, we also had 12 additional criteria to better understand the city. So the country, the region, the area, population density, and things like if they had infrastructure, modal split, and accessibility. So this would be the indicators to qualify if they are a 50-minute city or not, but our focus was on their practices. Also important to refer is the fact that actually the majority of the cities, 57 of them, had less than 3 practices implemented or planned. So, of course, the other half has a larger diversity, but in many cases, we found little diversity. I'm just going to jump shortly into one of these issues to give you a little bit more detail regarding the key areas. I'm not going to explain the scheme. The scheme you can find from the report Driving Urban Transitions to Sustainable Urban Futures from the DUT that classifies 4 key areas. The first, sustainable mobility, the second, people-centered urban space, the third about logistics, and the last about governance. But we looked at how the practices were organized in this sense. And we did this worldwide. Again, you cannot see anything in the world map, yet you can find the world map in the report. But if we look at the European scale, it's easier to see. So the larger the bubble, the higher amount of practices that are in the city. But then you can also see the distribution among these 4 key areas. And to give you a little bit more detail and some examples of what is going on, starting with the first key area on sustainable mobility, I would like to give you the example of Portland in the US. So what we found there was the promotion of sustainable mobility through the construction of pedestrian cycling infrastructure. They follow the concept of complete neighborhoods. So here you can find measures like mobility hubs, where they have frequent public transport and directly connected to walking and cycling infrastructure. They also have a measure that they call neighborhood greenways. It's essentially about green areas back to the city, but they are also connected to walking and cycling infrastructure. And also they have a very strong policy on relocation of road space. Another example, if we move on to the second group, and these 2 groups are where we find most of the practices in our review, connected now to people-centered urban spaces. I would give you the example of the measures we found in Paris, where we found, again, relocation of road space for public spaces, but also for active modes. The development of multi-purpose buildings and spaces. And here the example of Le Cours Oasis initiative, opening school buildings and playgrounds after hours for other uses is an interesting example to talk about, and also mixed land use neighborhoods in this case. But moving on to the third key area on logistics, promotion of local business, decentralization, employments, and so on. I would like to give you the example of a neighborhood in Hamburg, Grasbrook, which follows the 10 minutes quartier policy. And in this case, it became mandatory that all deliveries be made by cargo bike or alternatively via underground designated zones. And finally, to give you an example of the last group related to governance, where you can find things like public engagement, participatory planning, or street experiments or pilot projects. I would like to give you the example of Melbourne in Australia. They had 3 pilot projects on walkability assessment, so how to measure it, to provide safer roads for the elderly, for pedestrians. It was essentially a participatory planning project, and at the end, they developed what they called an activation plans, where they incorporated the contributions of this, of the citizens. And these are just some examples. You can find more in our report. To sum it up, at the end, we built what we call the 15-minute city typology. And to do this, we picked up the 24 criteria for the 414 practices of our cities. And we did a statistical analysis of these results, which then narrowed down our criteria to some more relevant at the statistical level with which we did cluster analysis, typical cluster analysis. And it was interesting to find out that our results of the cluster analysis distribution were very close to a statistical, to a concept used in the economy, which is a diffusion innovation theory. And this diffusion innovation theory essentially explores when you have a new technology coming in, how people react to this technology and how they take it up. And so they see in this theory, there is a very small amount of people that they call the innovators, that when they see a new technology, they immediately try it, whatever it means, whatever it brings them. And then you have the early adopters that come a little bit later, and they start trying the technology once they know and hear of the benefits. And then you have the early majority that comes still a little bit later, and that only decides to adopt the new technology, the innovation, once there is evidence of the benefits, and so on. You can more or less understand the meaning of the curve. And we decided to look at the 50 minutes typology from the lens of an innovation action adoption, because we can consider the 50-minute policy strategy as an innovation in urban policy. So adapting this to our case, as I told you, we are using just a couple of criteria, the ones that was consistently statistically more relevant. We used the issue if they had or not radical measures, if they had measures or practices on improving walking and cycling, the diversity of practices with regard to key areas of action, the diversity of practices among transport, land use, and planning actions, and the diversity in general. So how many keywords were available in each city. And just to give you an idea of what radical means, when we are looking at radical, we consider measures which think out of the box or have a more muscled action, such as the extensive road space allocation that was made by Barcelona with the Superblocks project, or the implementation in Pontevedra with the Carfi Center. But it could also be the example of the multipurpose buildings in Paris, or the active involvement of citizens in planning processes. So there are a number of different measures that we considered here. So how do we translate this into the 5 clusters? And focusing on the innovators, an innovator would be one that has radical measures implemented or planned, that has measures towards improving cycling and walking, that from the key areas has policies that go through all the 4 different key areas that we've seen before, that has land use, transport, and planning practices, and has a very high diversity of keywords, so above 18. And the remaining groups, when you go through the remaining groups, you have a lower diversity or lower comprehensive approach to the process. So this is the result of the typology at the world level, which you again can't see very well here, but you will be able to see it in the report. But focusing on Europe, we can see what is happening here. And just to give you a couple of examples, among the innovators, we found 3 cities, Barcelona, Melbourne, and Paris. And here, to give you the example of Paris, we found, for instance, mixed-use neighborhoods where they have multi-purpose buildings, where converted office space to housing, promoted co-living, decentralized financing to foster development of mixed amenities. Or another group of redistribution of road space to convert lanes, car lanes and parking to walking and cycling facilities and green spaces, and a very important project around the school streets. Or supporting local economy with initiatives like the Eat and Buy Locally, which is a program in Paris, or programs to improve literacy for low-income residents to prepare them for local jobs in circular economy, and of course, citizen engagement with this participatory project budget that Lisbon has. Moving on to an example on the early adopters, we found 8 cities. Edinburgh, Milan, Valencia, Portland, Shanghai, Sydney, Tucson, and Zagreb. And here I show you the example of Milan, where they have a group of measures reorganizing the neighborhood, so the decentralization of services, a focus on local shops instead of shopping districts. And they have something similar to Paris, which they call the Milan School Oasis. They also have a redistribution of public space with a project called the Open Piazza in every neighborhood, where they implement tactical urbanism designs. They also adhere to the Open Street Project. They have 30 kilometers per hour throughout the whole city, but all of this implemented through participatory projects. And then if we move on to the early majority, we find a larger group of cities, so 32, but here, of course, the strategies are less comprehensive, and some of them focus just on the transport modes and on the transport services themselves. So more informations are available on our report. I'll leave it here right now for your questions.